Hey, let's talk about light and shadows today. This is the first of a series of videos where I will go in depth about light, shadows, and how I approach capturing light on paper. I'm going to start off by running through the fundamentals of light and shadow, like the anatomy and terminology we'll be using. I'll also go over a few more advanced concepts here and there that may be helpful to know when you want to accurately capture realistic lighting. I'll try and include a wide range of information from beginner to advanced, so any artist at any level can get something out of these videos. Let's start off with the basic terminology by looking at the sphere and breaking it down. First, let's start off by zoning it out into two large zones, the light side and the shadow side. Let's break down the anatomy of the shadow first. There are broadly two types of shadows, the form shadow and the cast shadow. A form shadow is created when the planes of an object are turning away from the light source. A cast shadow is created when an object is blocking the light source from hitting another object or the ground plane. Let's break down the form shadow even further. The line or boundary where the form turns from light into shadow is called the terminator. You can also think about it as the edge where the light ends and the shadow begins. Light is always bouncing around and reflecting off all of the different objects and planes in the scene, so sometimes you get light reflecting back into the shadow areas, which illuminates the shadow a little bit. This is called reflected light or bounce light. Remember that bounce light is never as light as the direct light source. The core shadow is the area that is receiving the least amount of both direct light and bounce light. It's often perpendicular to the main light source and appears the darkest within the form shadow. Now let's break down what's inside the cast shadow. You can see that there are lighter and darker areas within the cast shadow. That's because bounce light often affects the cast shadow as well. The small area where the object casting the shadow is in contact with the ground plane is an area that has the least amount of light entering or bouncing around. This darkest area is called an ambient occlusion, or occlusion shadow. This area usually appears the darkest and is a good place to add dark accents to make an object feel more grounded. Next, let's break down the light. The planes that are in between or halfway between the shadow and the light side of the form are called the halftones. As you go all the way towards the light and get to the plane that is facing the light source directly, you get what's called the center light. This is very often confused with the highlight, which is the small specular light on the object that often appears to be the lightest light. Remember how light is always bouncing off of everything? Well, the light is bouncing off of the sphere too. So the highlight is actually the point or points at which the light source is reflecting off of the object and directly into the viewer's eyes, so your own eyes. It's kind of like a weaker version of when you reflect the sun off of a mirror into your eyes and it blinds you a little bit. Okay, congrats! We've made it through most of the basics of light and shadow anatomy and terminology. But now I kind of want to take some time to actually see these working in the real world and go a little bit more in depth into some of the components. Let's start off by looking at a real-world example of a center light and a highlight to better understand the difference between the two. So here I've set up a little still life of the sculpture by this artist, Sun Mo. She does these really cute sculptures called hurdlings. I've been a huge fan and collector for a while. Yeah, go check out her work. It's really cute. But yeah, I've chosen this object for a still life setup because it has a very reflective surface and it's really easy to see the difference between the center light and the highlight. Here I've just set up one light source from the top right, and yeah, let's determine where the center light is first. To demo this, I just folded a piece of paper a few times to create some planes, and I placed it along the top of the form of the sculpture. You can see pretty clearly which plane is receiving the most light here. That plane is where your center light is. Obviously, the actual sculpture can be broken down into a lot more planes, but you can get a general idea of where the center light will be with this method. And then you can keep breaking down the planes even further in your head if you want more accuracy. If you're drawing a live model and you can't just go up and tape a piece of paper onto the model, you can also get a pretty accurate estimate by just taking your pencil and angling it from the light source to the subject matter. I think drawing isn't always about total accuracy, so just having a good estimate of where the center light is helps me make better and more informed decisions. Now let's look at the highlight. You can see immediately that when I remove the piece of paper, the highlights are not where the center light is. You can also see that because this object is not a simple sphere, there are multiple points at which the light is reflecting back into my eye, or in this case, the camera. If you ever get confused whether a certain area is the center light or the highlight, a super easy way to test it out is to physically move around. Because the highlight is dependent on where your eye is in relation to the light source and the object that it's reflecting off of, you'll see that the highlights move around and change as you move around. So you can see here that if I move the camera around, the highlights change. But even if I change my position, or angle, the center light is always objectively constant because it is not dependent on my location. Next, I want to go a little bit deeper into the characteristics of a core shadow. Just to recap, the core shadow is the area that's receiving the least amount of both direct and bounce light. Core shadows can vary in darkness, thickness, and firmness depending on how dramatic the turn of the form is and how much direct light and bounce light it's receiving. I have a piece of paper here to demonstrate how the turn of the form can dictate the appearance of a core shadow. If I bend this paper at a very shallow angle, the core shadow is very wide and soft. But if I keep bending the paper at a sharper and sharper angle, the core shadow starts to become thinner and firmer. You can see a good range of how much a core shadow can change by making a cone with a piece of paper. You can see that the base of the cone, where the form is turning slower, has a wider and softer core shadow. And as you move toward the tip of the cone, where the form is turning faster, the core shadow becomes thinner, firmer, and sharper. You can use this knowledge in your drawings by adjusting the darkness, thickness, and firmness of your core shadows to describe how different forms are turning. The last thing I want to delve deeper into today is the cast shadow. Let's start off by going over how to determine the shape of your cast shadow. Draw a line down from the light source to the edges of the terminators on your object. Then continue that line all the way down to the ground plane and plot a point. You can do this as many times as you need. Once you have enough points on the ground, you can connect those points to create the cast shadow shape. In this diagram, I plotted the cast shadow shape assuming the light source is a point light source, which means that it has no dimension. A point light source would create a completely crisp shadow edge. However, most light sources in the real world have dimension. If you look at most types of lamps or even the sun, they have a width. So you have to consider the slight offset of the light rays coming from one side of the light source and the other side. So when you're plotting the shadows based on these two different angles, your shadows will also have a slight offset, resulting in a double shadow or a fuzzy edge. The fancy word for this effect is the penumbra. Another factor that could affect the penumbra is the distance between the light source and the object. The penumbra widens if a dimensional light source gets closer to the object because the angles are that much more extreme. In a similar way, the same thing happens if the distance between the object and the ground plane increases. Let's see this happening in real life. For this, I've set up another still life with this sculpture. If you look at the light source I'm using here, you can see that it's very long and very close to the still life. So I actually had to tape a piece of black paper onto it to make the width of the light shorter. By doing this, I get clearer shadows with less penumbra. If I take the paper off, you can really see how the width and closeness of this light source affects the clarity of the shadows. Just so we can see it happening again, this is with the shorter light source and this is with the longer. So you can really see how big of a difference that makes to the cast shadow. I think a lot of schools teach artists that cast shadows just get arbitrarily fuzzier as they get further away from the subject matter, but I think it's important to at least know why this actually happens, so that if you want to be more accurate in capturing the specific lighting scenario in front of you, you're able to do that. Okay, yay! You've made it to the end of my crash course on light and shadow terminology. I know that was a lot of information, but I think it's good to always have these concepts in the back of your mind. I think in the next light and shadow video, I'll get into how I actually use these concepts in my work, and maybe even get into some drawing techniques for how to capture light as well. Until then, bye!